Hello everyone, I'm Jane Farrell from the Florentine, and this evening we're here with Simon Gammell, the Director of the British Institute of Florence, as part of our TF Together series. He's going to be giving us a talk titled A Royal Tourist in Florence. But first, perhaps Simon, you could tell us a bit about the British Institute right now and how you've adapted to our new digital reality.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. Good evening, everybody. No, we are, of course, like everybody, under full lockdown. Our two buildings, our language school and our library, are both closed, but we've got a lot of people working from home, and we've actually adapted quite well to operating in a virtual digital environment. Over at the school, they did a remarkable job of switching from face-to-face teaching to online English lessons pretty much overnight. And it's now the new normal. 90% of our students are now attending their lessons through various forms of video conferencing with the teachers working from home. And on the cultural side, we've got running our traditional Wednesday evening lectures, which have been running at the Institute for about 30 years, which are now being delivered by Zoom every Wednesday. And it's gone really well. We've reached out to our friends and alumni all over the world, and last week we had 220 people signing in from literally all points of the planet. So that's been a lot of fun. And spinning off of that, starting 11th of May, we're going to experiment with a 5-day history of art seminar, targeted at people who know a certain amount about history of art and really want to go a bit deeper with the great art of Florence, and with Jeremy Boudreau, our well-known head of history of art. So one way or another, we got quite a lot going, yeah, we're pretty happy about it. Thank you.
No, certainly it seems like you've been very busy and adapted very quickly as well, which is commendable. It's, adapting in such a large way surely presents certain difficulties, but it seems like you've managed to rise to the challenge, let's say, and the Institute seems to be really thriving, which is wonderful to see.
And in a funny way, we're learning all sorts of new skills, which will be good for us and part of the deal once we get to the other side and can start seeing our friends and customers face to face again.
Eventually, exactly. That's wonderful.
Okay. So, do you think we should get going with the talk? Yeah. Okay. I'll fiddle around to get it on the screen, and you can entertain the punters, Jane.
Of course. No, the only piece of information here is people feel free to ask your questions in the comments, and Simon will address those questions at the end of his talk. And also, the British Institute is raising funds for Il Cuore di Firenze with their lecture series. You can see the information here at the bottom of your screens. So that will present all the information on how they're also doing their part in terms of contributing to those in need at the moment as well. And
we have a major technical problem here, Jane. It's not working.
Is it not?
It's not working. I don't know. Can you see that?
Not yet.
No, you can't.
These are the challenges of live presentations.
This is what we were doing when we were practicing 5 minutes ago.
It always works well in practice.
It ain't working.
Not to worry. What I'll do in the meantime is direct people to our Healing Not Broken special, which you can download for free. It's a mammoth issue, 106 pages, which was put together with a lot of love and care by our editor-in-chief, Helen Farrell, and it brings together a huge number of contributions from well-known Florentine names to, reveal the experience of quarantine in Florence, and also give some of the plans for the future and the direction we're going to be heading, which is hopefully a positive one. And following that, also another piece of information I can share with you is that immediately after this talk at 6 p.m, our editor-in-chief, Helen, will be giving a talk on Zoom as part of the British Institute's lecture series. And you can see the link here, and also the ID and password. And I'll share that again at the end of the talk, because I see Simon's slides have arrived, so I can present them now.
Yay!
Hand it over to Simon.
I 5th time around, I made it work. Okay, everybody, so I will now start my lecture on a royal tourist in Florence. The royal tourist in question is none other than Queen Victoria, who visited Florence 3 times in 1888, 1893, and 1894. She was already 69 on her first visit, and she was 75 by the time she came for the last time in 94. Each visit was for almost exactly a month, from the middle of March to the middle of April, and they were very definitely holidays. She traveled as the Countess of Balmoral, with a view to trying to keep formality and protocol to the minimum, but she still had dinner with the King of Italy, Umberto, in Palazzo Pitti, with, I suppose, a few close friends. It's very surprising that she didn't visit Florence and Italy earlier in her life, because her husband, Prince Albert, had done a grand tour a few months before they were married in 1840. He, in fact, spent 3 months in Florence as a guest of the Marchese Guerini in his palazzo on Via Ricasoli. It was a year before they got married, and by all accounts, Albert really had a good time, really enjoyed his visit to Florence, went around and saw a lot of the art and the churches, got involved with the strong Anglo-Florentine social life, but they never went back as a couple. It seems that they would go more typically on the holiday to Germany, to visit Albert's friends and relations. Victoria herself had a strong engagement with Italian, because as a child she studied Italian, and later on, when she started to visit Florence, she was heard to remark to Maestro Pietro Mascagni, who was visiting Windsor and playing excerpts from his opera Cavaliere Rusticano, and Victoria said, "Ama molto l'Italia e gli italiani." So she was an Italophile from birth. From her childhood, but they never got there together, even though their home, their holiday home on the Isle of Wight, Osborne House, they rebuilt very much in the Italian style. And when they weren't going to Germany for holidays, they would go to Osborne for their annual holidays from 1845 until Albert's death in 1861. It was, as everyone knows, when Albert died, Queen Victoria went into 3 years mourning, dropped out of public view altogether, and she never fully recovered from the loss of her beloved husband. And it was only 10 years after his death in 1861 that she started to go abroad again. And that's when she started the idea of having an annual spring holiday somewhere in Europe to take the air and see the sea. So for the first many years, she would go to the French Riviera. And it was only in 1879 that she, for the very first time, visited Italy, when she took a holiday on Lake Maggiore at Baveno, which she, by all accounts, enjoyed very much. So it was 9 years later that she finally made it to Florence. And her first visit, she was a guest of Countess of Crawford and Balcarres at the Villa Palmieri, there in the picture. The Crawfords had acquired the house in 1847, so by the time of Victoria's visit, they'd been living there for 40 years, and they were very much key players of the now established English colony at Florence. Then they put a huge effort into creating an English garden for the villa, though it may be somewhat overwhelmed the rather charming medieval garden that had been there before, which many people believe was the original site for Boccaccio's Decameron. Villa Palmieri has a long and deep story going back to Matteo Palmieri, who built the villa. Matteo Palmieri was a very close ally of Cosimo de' Medici. He was a politician, but also a humanist and a poet. And he commissioned this rather wonderful Assumption of the Virgin by Francesco Botticini, but unfortunately died before it was finished. Though it was put into his funeral chapel at San Pier Maggiore as the altarpiece before eventually it ended up in the National Gallery in London. That is, you can see at the top, you've got the painting, and then down on the corner, there he is Matteo. And here's the close-up of Matteo with Villa Palmieri represented in the background there. And then look the other way, you have a rather fine view of 15th century Florence. These days, Villa Palmieri is owned and occupied by the European University Institute up near Fiesole. But before the Crawfords took it on, it had been in the hands of another famous British expatriate, Third Earl Cowper, who acquired it in 1780. George Nassau Clavering Cowper was the godson of George II, and to finish his education, it was planned that he should go on the Grand Tour with his chatelaine Jean Chastain. He was already independently wealthy. He'd inherited from his grandfather, who had made a fortune with the East India Company. And when he got to Florence, he started to settle. After 3 years, Chastain returned home, leaving him behind. And even when it was arranged that Cowper should have a seat at the House of the English Parliament, he didn't want to go back for any length of time. In 1775, he married the 16-year-old Hannah Gore. There she is, now he is admiring her. And they returned to live in Villa Palmieri, where they stayed pretty much for the rest of their lives, running a salon and being major players in the Anglo-Florentine social scene. Hannah Gore grew from being a shrinking violet into quite a player in her own right. And Cowper was a great art collector, and he acquired from Johann Zoffany, who painted it. This is a painting by Johann Zoffany, and Zoffany was also an art dealer and sold this Raphael to Cowper. It's known as the, so I've lost my place. It's the Niccolini Cowper Madonna, because Zoffany had acquired it from the Niccolini family. And so Cowper has his name on this Raphael to this day. And here's a famous picture of the Tribuna of the Uffizi. And there you can see that's Zoffany there. Interesting Cowper in acquiring the Raphael Madonna. And over this side, you've got Cowper's great friend and rival, Horace Mann, who was the British consul in Florence for 50 years, admiring a Titian. This painting was done by Zoffany himself under commission from the Queen of England, Queen Charlotte. The picture of the Tribuna depicts many English milords, some resident in Florence, others doing the Grand Tour, looking at acquiring valuable and important works of art to take home with them as mementos. Queen Victoria herself didn't do any of that, but she did acquire a dog called Gina. There's Gina. And that was on her second visit to Florence, and took Gina home to London and started a craze for Pomeranians amongst the court circles back in London. Nowadays, of course, tourists still like to take bits of Florence home with them. The Crawfords were typical of and leading lights of the large resident English population of Florence, the Anglo-Florentines, the English colony, if you like. And another major player was John Templeton, leader, whom Queen Victoria visited on her first visit in 1888, and signed the visitors' book on the 15th of April that day. Leader had been a successful politician and socialite in London until his sudden and unexplained departure to the continent in 1844. He first went to Cannes and then on to Florence, where he purchased the ruins of the medieval castle at Vinciliata. And he's poured a fortune into restoring the castle and the villas on the estate. And he undertook a huge project to create a romantic English garden in the grounds of the castle. And these gardens are to this day called the Parco Romantico della Regina, memorializing the fact that Queen Victoria formally inaugurated these gardens on her visit in April 1893. And here you can see in the corner there it says 1893. Here she is with her favorite pastime of sketching the tower on the lake in the Vigiliana Park. This was one of the things she liked to do most when she was traveling was to take a sketchbook with and out of doors make sketches. And here you can see someone's done a lithograph of her sketching with one of her Indian servants in attendance, who of course caused a great stir when they came to Florence because they hadn't seen so much Indian people with Sikh turbans. Here's some other sketches of hers, some perhaps in Italy, some in Scotland. But here you see the Highlanders, who she also took with her to Florence and also amused the locals. On her final visit to Florence in 1894, Victoria was almost 75, and she was a lot older. So it was arranged by the then British consul at Florence, Dominic Colnaghi, that she should stay at Villa Fabbricotti, which is nearer the city than Villa Palmieri. The Villa Fabbricotti, unlike the Crawfords, the Fabbricotti were required to vacate the villa so that the Queen could stay. And the gas lighting, which they recently had installed, was considered too dangerous for the Queen and was removed. The villa, there it is, I lost my place, excuse me. There is Fabbricotti, and here is the Queen inside Fabbricotti. You can see a photograph from the contemporary times and a lithograph showing her in that room without any Fabbricotti in view. But her neighbor at Fabbricotti, just literally over the boundary, was Frederick Stibert, who had set up Villa Stibert. Frederick Stibert was an Englishman who was born in Italy and educated in England. And in 1849, aged 11, he inherited a vast fortune on the death of his father. He divided his time between his villa just to the north of Florence and London. But his life's work was the construction of his vast collection of primarily armaments, but also a lot of other art and artifacts, and remodeling the villa to house this huge collection. The collection and the villa was left on his death in perpetuity to the city of Florence and is now owned by the Comune. For Victoria's visit, Stibert constructed a special walkway to link his park with that of Villa Fabbricotti. And the Queen, who, as I say, was much older by this stage, was showing her age by the time of her last visit, spent a lot of her visit simply exploring the two parks in her donkey cart and sketching and having a slow and leisurely lunch without any visitors. She was having a very quiet holiday this time around. She went to visit the park of Villa Stibert next door. And here's an entry from her diary. I went out from 12 to 1 with Beatrice, her English princess daughter, going into Mr. Stibert's charming grounds. A week later, she decided to actually call on Frederick Stibert and see the villa. And so we have a bit of correspondence from her secretary, Henry Ponsonby, who wrote on the 27th, "Dear Mr. Stibert, if you will permit, the Queen wishes to visit Villa Stibert tomorrow, Wednesday at 12 o'clock midday. Yours sincerely, Henry Ponsonby." Next day, Stibert replied saying, "Sure." And Ponsonby writes, "Dear Mrs. Stibert, yes, I think the Queen would be glad if you were present. She won't go up any stairs. Yours sincerely, Ponsonby." And to make that really clear, later the same day, he wrote again saying, "Dear Mrs. Stibert, the Queen will not go up any stairs today, but she will go around in her chair only on the ground floor of the villa. Yours sincerely." And there, still at the villa, they have the chair that the Queen used for her visit. She wasn't so good at walking by now, and so she did tend to use a bath chair quite a lot. And this is what she saw. and as it was then and as it is now, the famous Cavalcade of Knights, which is a centerpiece of the extraordinary collection of armaments at Villa Stibert. And to commemorate the visit, she signed the visitor's book. This is the visitor's book at Villa Stibert, and there she is, Victoria R. Regina, March 28th, 1894. Princess Beatrice signs as well. Two ladies in waiting, Jane Churchill and Harriet Phipps. But most interesting for those who follow these things is that down the bottom you have Abdul Karim, the Munshi, has signed, complete with his Hindi version of his name. And there is an authentic picture of the Munshi with Queen Victoria, and here, of course, the recent film, Victoria and Abdul, with Judi Dench telling the story of the Queen's very special relationship with the Munshi, her favorite Indian servant. Somebody, whether it was the royal visitors or the Stiberts, decided that class structure and protocol should be adhered to, and drew a thick black line to below the ladies in waiting before the Indian servant. Now, and this is Villa Fabbricotti these days, sadly neglected. Nobody quite knows what to do with it. Queen Victoria's visits to Florence were very much the visits of somebody wanting a holiday, a royal tourist. And this is what had started to happen through the 19th century as the exclusive and very slow visits of the aristocracy on the grand tour, when often they spend 2-3 years wandering slowly through France and Italy, had been democratized of wider distribution of wealth as a result of the Industrial Revolution, but also crucially the arrival of steam transport. So it was much easier and quicker to get from London down to Florence and stay for just a few weeks. Here's a map very much for the tourist market, dated 1830, of Florence, with the bobbly gardens down the bottom. So very much already the English market for tourism is opening up in Florence. And like many people, she traveled by train, though the royal train was perhaps somewhat more comfortable than the average steamer. And she had quite an entourage. She had 80 people with her, occupied 13 carriages of her private train. They included members of the family, in particular her youngest daughter and constant companion, Princess Beatrice, whom she called Baby, and her daughter's long-suffering husband, Prince Henry of Battenberg. There were two ladies in waiting, as we saw in the visitor's book, her private secretary, Ponsonbury, and her personal doctor. A Church of England minister, usually a bishop, travelled, kilt-clad Scotsmen and Indian servants. And the Queen always sent ahead of her carriages, especially her landau and her donkey cart, her bed, her green leather-covered writing desk, and her crystal china and cutlery from Windsor Castle, so that they would all be in Florence waiting for her arrival. So though these were, by her standards, informal and incognito holidays, by ordinary standards, she was still doing it in some style. But while she was in Florence, apart from the social circle of the Anglo-Florentine scene, she'd like to spend her time doing the normal things that tourists like to do. She wrote in her diaries how she particularly liked the Ghirlandaio frescoes at the Palazzo Vecchio, and she would attend special festivals such as the Scoppio del Carro, which she witnessed from an upper window at the Loggia di Gallo. But as mentioned before, her favorite activity by a distance was driving out into the country in one of her landaus and doing sketching. This was her way of recording her holiday. It's nowadays, of course, people do it rather quicker. And here she is driving out in her carriage through the city, with adoring crowds. This is one of our more formal passages. It was said that as she drove past the Duomo, she took out a miniature of Albert that she always had around her person and held it up and said, "Look, Albert, I finally got here." But her most favorite activity was to be out in the countryside, so where she could stop and sketch. Tourists nowadays also like to get out and about, but they have less time, so they go quicker. And just to end up with, here is her memorial fountain, which used to be sited at the old entrance to the Cachenet. But since they remodeled the Cachenet at the city end and put in the tramvia, it's now become completely isolated, abandoned, neglected, and forgotten in the car park. You can just see the VR for Victoria Regina there. And there was a scheme a few years ago to rescue it. Somebody said it was going to cost 25,000 euros to move it back into the Cachenet properly and restore it properly, because it's a rather sad memorial for the royal visits to Florence. I don't suppose anyone's got 25,000 euros at this particular time in our history, but if you do want to do something good, you could always pay for the renovation of the statue of the fountain. And so there you have it. The Queen Victoria came for holidays, mingled with the Anglo-Florentine elites, but actually behaved like a tourist, as was beginning to be the way for the Victorian visitors, paving the way for the mass tourism we see today. That's my lecture. Apologize if it was not very coherent, because it's very strange doing it without an audience. But you're all out there somewhere, and I'll now stop sharing. And Jane, maybe if anyone wants to ask a question, we can do that.
Absolutely. That was fascinating, Simon. Thank you. There was a lot there I'd never realized. It certainly adds a lot of color to experiencing Florence, thinking about those past footsteps through the cobbled streets, etc. It's very interesting. There was a question about how she had traveled to Italy, but then you answered it. So other than that, we have not received another question, except that I have my own, if that's okay, which is, does the British Institute Library have any books on this topic if someone was prompted to look into it any further?
Do you know, when I was researching this talk, and the first version of it I delivered at, sorry, I've got lots of background disturbance here. The first version I delivered at an event at the Villa Stibert last year sometime, because it was the 200th anniversary of Victoria's birth. There's very little material on this. I found one lithograph which was in Italian, which somebody had written about it. The rest is really just sort of piecing it together from fragments. So no, we haven't got any definitive text about the royal visit, unfortunately.
Interesting, something someone could put together someday, perhaps. There's
Indeed.
a lot of interesting material in there.
Yeah.
Unless someone would like to add in a question now, Simon, perhaps I could just again reiterate that at 6 p.m, which is in just a short half hour, Helen Farrell will be joining the British Institute lecture series and giving a talk titled Healing Not Broken. And you can see the information here in the comments. And let me just see. No, Simon, I think you've covered so much there that people are left pondering it all and reflecting on such an interesting subject. So thank you so much. And
well, it's my pleasure, and thanks for inviting me. And I've now got to change hats and go over to the other platform, Zoom, and get ready to host your boss, Helen, your partner.
Exactly. That's
all right.
We shall see everyone there. So at 6 p.m. So time for a quick mug of tea, and then speak to you then. Thank you again, Simon.
Okay. Bye for now. Good luck, everyone. Bye.